They mocked him. A lonely veteran bought a rusted, abandoned train car in the middle of nowhere, and everyone thought he'd lost his mind. But what they didn't know was what he was about to build inside. This isn't just a story about a train car. It's about grief, about redemption, and how one man, forgotten by the world, turned rust and wood into something no one saw coming. Before we dive in, tell us where in the world are you watching from? And don't forget to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow's episode is truly mind-blowing. Let's get started. The morning sun fought its way through the dusty blinds of a cramped apartment in Akron, Ohio. Light fell on the chipped wallpaper and the yellowed ceiling, cracked from years of neglect. Samuel Carter, a 61-year-old war veteran, sat quietly at the edge of his creaky twin bed. He held a dented coffee mug in both hands, half full of lukewarm instant coffee, half empty like the life he'd been living since the world changed on him. The silence wasn't new. It had been his only companion since Amelia, his wife of 34 years, passed away from lung cancer. She'd been the melody in his mornings, the warmth in his winters. Now all that remained was the sound of an old radiator rattling like a memory that wouldn't leave. The apartment was nearly bare, just a metal bed frame, a second-hand table, 2 folding chairs, and a small photo of her taped to the wall. Amelia, smiling at a picnic, sunlight in her hair. He hadn't smiled like that in years. Outside, the Ohio winter groaned against the glass, but Samuel didn't shiver. He'd been through colder things in war, in grief, and in the echoing quiet of a life paused too long. That night, as the wind howled outside his apartment, Samuel Carter found himself staring at the same chipped photo of Amelia, lit by the soft flicker of a desk lamp. His joints ached. The VA check had come late again, and the heat barely stayed on. The walls around him whispered of time and loss, and for the first time in months, he opened the shoebox under the table, the one filled with scraps of a life her letters, pressed flowers from their old backyard, and an old land deed with his name still printed in fading ink. He had forgotten about it. 30 acres of wooded land outside Asheville, North Carolina, inherited from his grandfather, but untouched for decades. Just trees, overgrown trails, and a broken fence. He hadn't set foot there since he was a boy, riding shotgun in a rusted pickup as his granddad pointed out deer tracks and blackberry bushes. He thumbed through the letters, her handwriting, looping and gentle, whispered through time. Don't sit still too long. Sam, life needs moving feet. Maybe it was exhaustion. Maybe grief had finally wrapped itself so tightly around his ribs he had to tear at it just to breathe. But that night, in a haze of caffeine and longing, Samuel opened his browser and started scrolling. Tools, radios, junk he didn't need, until one listing stopped him cold. Vintage Pullman railcar, 1924. Rusted, needs work. $800 or best offer. Buyer responsible for transport. Located Shepherd's Hollow, West Virginia. He stared at the grainy photo. The rail car sat like a sleeping ghost on a forgotten track, half swallowed by weeds and time. The windows were broken. The paint had peeled down to raw steel. But something about it pulled at him. It wasn't beauty. It wasn't practicality. It was memory. His grandfather had called them castles on wheels. Samuel remembered one trip, when he was no more than 7. The scent of oiled leather, the rhythmic clatter of tracks, the deep rattling echo that sang through the car as they moved. That was the last time he remembered feeling safe. He clicked on the ad. His heart, for the first time in years, beat faster. He imagined it sitting on that old land quiet, surrounded by pine and oak, a place no one could take, a project not for survival, but for purpose. His logical mind fought back. You're too old. You've got no money. You're one busted hip away from a care home. But another voice whispered beneath it. What if you don't do this? What if this is the last door that opens, and you walk away? He didn't sleep that night. By morning, he'd made 3 phone calls. The first, the seller, a retired rail worker who laughed when Samuel asked if it was still available. "It's yours if you can haul it out of here." The second, a transport company. The quote made Samuel whistle, but it was doable if he sold nearly everything. The third, a county clerk in North Carolina. The land was still in his name. 3 days later, Samuel was living out of cardboard boxes. He sold his television, his tools, even Amelia's old rocking chair. He kept only what mattered: her letters, a flashlight, 2 blankets, and a duffel bag of clothes. When the transfer cleared, he wired the money, signed the paperwork, and waited. The morning he left, the apartment was silent as ever. He stood in the doorway one last time, touching the edge of the wall where Amelia's laughter used to echo. No one said goodbye. No one knew he was leaving. The truck arrived 2 days later, towing the Pullman car behind it. Samuel followed in his beat-up Chevy, hands clenched on the wheel, the wind roaring louder than his thoughts. As they turned off the highway and onto the winding forest road, it all came flooding back: the smell of pine needles, the flash of deer through the trees, the crooked mailbox that still bore his family's name, Carter. And there, behind a rusted gate and a wall of bramble, was the land. Nothing stood anymore. The cabin had collapsed. The trails were overgrown, but the air was still the same: clean, damp, alive. The Pullman car was offloaded onto a crooked length of track that hadn't seen a train in 50 years. The winch groaned, metal screamed. The wheels dragged across the dirt until finally it settled with a hollow thud. The driver spat his gum and gave a half-hearted thumbs up. "You sure about this?" Samuel looked out across the trees. The silence was different here. Not empty, just waiting, I'm sure. The truck pulled away, and Samuel stood alone, duffel at his feet, eyes locked on the rusted rail car. Its windows stared back like hollow eyes, its skin peeled like an old scar. But inside, he saw something else. A future, a beginning, not grand, not promised, but his. He laid a hand on the side of the car. The metal was cold, solid, real, just like him. The first night inside the Pullman was brutal. Samuel spread his sleeping bag in the middle of the car, near where a stove once stood, long since rusted into ruin. He lit a small lantern, hung it from a hook overhead, and tried to settle in. The air was thick with the smell of mold, old metal, and loneliness. Every gust of wind moaned through the cracks in the car like a voice grieving in the dark. Something scurried near the back, maybe a raccoon, maybe a rat. He clutched the flashlight tighter and tried to remember the calm he'd felt earlier. But it had disappeared with the sun. He didn't sleep much. Instead, he whispered Amelia's name like a prayer. He could still see her standing at the window of their old house, waving as he left for deployment. He could still hear her laugh when he tripped over his own boots. He could still feel the weight of her hand in his when the doctor said the word no soldier could ever prepare for incurable. By dawn, his eyes were raw, his joints stiff. But when the cold air kissed his face and he stepped outside, something stirred in him. The world was soaked in mist, and the leaves glistened like they had been waiting for someone to notice them. He breathed in. He was still here. That day. Samuel didn't try to fix anything. He just walked the clearing. He picked up fallen branches. He measured with his steps. He muttered plans to himself under his breath, like blueprints only his heart could understand. Clean the inside. Patch the floor. Cover the broken windows. One thing at a time. By midday, he had boiled creek water in a dented tin cup, eaten from a can of cold beans, and started sweeping out the Pullman with an old push broom he'd brought from the apartment. Dust exploded into the air, making his throat itch and his eyes water, but he didn't stop. Not once. He was sweeping out the rear end of the car when the broom caught on something, a small gap in the wooden wall, just below a warped luggage rack. Curious. Samuel crouched and pulled at the panel. It shifted with a groan, revealing a loose metal plate. Behind it was a crate, old, wooden, heavier than it looked. He dragged it into the center of the car, heart pounding like he'd uncovered buried treasure. The hinges screamed as he forced the lid open. Inside, wrapped in decades of dust, was a set of tools, hand tools, wooden-handled hammers, chisels, a handsaw with teeth like shark fins, and a brass compass. Tools that weren't just old, they were loved, used, preserved. And tucked in the corner, wedged between a coil of wire and an oil can, was a notebook. Samuel's hands trembled as he lifted it. The cover was cracked leather, the kind that smells like time. On the front, W.C., summer of '69. His grandfather's initials. He opened it. The pages were filled with tight cursive, not just diagrams and repairs, though there were plenty of those, but thoughts, life lessons, reflections. If you fix something with care, it'll carry your handprint longer than your name. Wood rots, metal rusts, but intention lasts. Samuel sat back on his heels. The dust, the silence, the grief, they all fell away for a moment. This wasn't just an old rail car. It was a legacy. He read page after page, each one a thread tying him to something deeper than blood or duty. His grandfather had worked this car, had dreamed of turning it into a cabin, a retreat. But life had gotten in the way. Now, by some twist of fate, Samuel had found the pieces. And the blueprints weren't just technical, they were spiritual. One line, scribbled in the margin, caught his breath in his throat. One day, someone will finish what I started. Maybe not for me, but for themselves. He closed the book gently, like he was tucking in an old friend. That night, he lit a fire just outside the car, wrapped himself in 2 blankets, and stared up at the stars through the clearing's canopy. He didn't feel lost anymore. He felt found, chosen. The Pullman hadn't just waited. It had remembered. The morning after discovering his grandfather's toolbox and journal, Samuel rose with the frost still clinging to the forest floor. His back protested, his fingers were stiff, but something in his chest was lighter. He boiled water in his blackened tin cup and took his coffee out to the platform steps of the Pullman car. The rusted beast behind him still looked broken, the paint still peeled, the windows still gaped like missing teeth. But now, he didn't see ruin. He saw material, potential, history. He saw a home. That day, Samuel set to work, slowly, intentionally. He patched the worst holes in the flooring using boards salvaged from the collapsed shed behind the old trail. He sealed the windows with plastic and duct tape, ugly, but functional. And he created a plan, not grand, not fast, but one he could wake up to. Sweep, repair, sand, repeat. His hands began to remember things they hadn't done in decades. Grip, measure, saw. His back ached, his knees groaned, but he didn't stop. He lost hours inside the motion of building. The silence that used to smother him now became a kind of rhythm. It wasn't empty anymore. It was earned. Every night he'd sit by the fire and read another passage from his grandfather's journal. The wisdom inside wasn't flashy. It was slow, humble. Words built by calloused hands. You don't fix a place in a day. You fix it every time you choose not to walk away. Even rot can hold beauty if you know where to look. 3 days into the repairs, something changed. It wasn't the wind or the trees or the Pullman itself. It was a sound small, light, hesitant, the crunch of leaves. Samuel looked up from the plank he was measuring and saw him. A boy, maybe 9 or 10, skinny, with a backpack that looked too big for his shoulders. He stood just beyond the clearing, behind a patch of wild ferns, watching. Samuel didn't move, he just raised a hand in greeting. The boy blinked, unsure, then bolted back into the woods. Samuel chuckled to himself. Well, that's new. The next day, he returned. Didn't say a word at first, just stood by the tree line, watching again. This time, Samuel went back to work, letting the boy be. After a while, he looked up and found the boy had crept a little closer. "You live in that?" the boy finally asked, pointing to the train car. Trying to, Samuel replied, wiping sawdust from his hands. Looks like a rust bucket. Samuel smiled. It is. The boy hesitated. I'm Caleb. Samuel? My mom says there's a crazy old man in the woods. She might be right. Caleb laughed, and just like that, the air shifted. From then on, Caleb became a regular shadow in the afternoons. He'd appear near the same tree, slowly inching closer until one day he stood right beside Samuel, eyeing the tools with fascination. Can I hold the hammer? You can hold it when you learn how to respect it. And so Samuel began teaching him not just hammer and nail, but the quiet discipline of building. Measure twice, cut once, stand tall when you work, even if you're tired. Caleb soaked it in like water in dry ground. He was a quiet kid, but sharp. And for the first time in a long time, Samuel found his days shaped by something other than memory. Then, one Saturday morning, Samuel heard footsteps, heavier ones, on the path leading into the clearing. He turned and saw her. A tall woman in worn jeans and a blue sweatshirt, arms crossed, eyes guarded. Caleb stood beside her, already grinning. You're Miss Carter, she asked. Samuel, he replied, extending a hand. She looked at the rail car, the wood neatly stacked, the rail ties cleaned, the ground swept of debris. Her shoulders relaxed just barely. I'm Grace, Caleb's mom. He talks about this place a lot. You're both welcome any time, Samuel said. She nodded. He said you're teaching him. With tools. I'm trying. He hasn't been this focused on anything since his dad passed, she murmured, almost to herself. Samuel didn't know what to say, so he just nodded. That afternoon, Grace left a Tupperware of cornbread on the step, and Samuel felt something shift again. The Pullman was still a rusted relic, but now the forest didn't feel as empty. And for the first time in years, Samuel Carter didn't feel like he was building just for himself. He was building with someone, for something. And the silence. It began to sound a lot like hope. Weeks passed, and the rhythm of the woods settled into Samuel's bones like a second heartbeat. Each morning, he rose before the sun, brewed his tin cup of bitter coffee, and sat quietly on the steps of the Pullman car. Mist hovered over the earth, clinging to the trees like breath. Birds began to treat him like a fixture. Even the squirrels had stopped being afraid of him. The Pullman still bore the marks of time, but little by little, it was changing just like he was. The floor was now solid beneath his boots, the roof patched with reclaimed tin and sealed from the wind. One corner of the car had become a sleeping nook, with a cot, wool blanket, and a photo of Amelia above it. The other end, a workbench, lit by a small window Grace helped him fix with salvaged glass. Curtains, sewn from scraps and donated by Grace's church group, swayed softly in the breeze. The car smelled like cedar, fresh paint, and faintly of cinnamon thanks to the candle Caleb had insisted on leaving behind. And then the visitors started coming. At first, it was just Grace again, dropping off leftover stew and extra thread. Then Caleb's classmates, curious and wide-eyed, came biking down the path. One of them, a lanky kid named Lucas, said, "It looks like a museum from a movie." Samuel chuckled. "It's just a train car." "No," Lucas replied. "It's more than that." The next day, the boy came back with a small wooden sign, carved in shaky lettering, Hope Line, Est 1924. Samuel almost cried right there on the spot. He nailed the sign just above the front door. And just like that, people began to care. A retired librarian, Mrs. Evelyn Henderson, brought books, dozens of them, Baldwin, Twain, Hughes, and a worn Bible with someone's note still in the margins. A mother of 3 came with a broken chair and asked, shyly, if Samuel might take a look. A high school shop teacher dropped off scrap wood. A local farmer left sweet potatoes on the step with a note that simply said, "Thank you." People came not because the train car was perfect. They came because something broken had been made useful again, and that made them feel something about their own lives. One Sunday afternoon, as golden light filtered through the trees, Caleb tugged at Samuel's sleeve. "You should tell your story," he said. "I don't have a story," Samuel replied. "You do," Caleb said. "You just don't know it's good yet." A few days later, Grace brought her cousin, who worked at the local elementary school. She listened quietly while Samuel explained how the Pullman car had once been a luxury vehicle, crafted by skilled black hands, but often off-limits to the very people who built it. "Would you ever consider letting the kids see this?" the teacher asked. "We're teaching Reconstruction and civil rights, but this is living history." Samuel hesitated. He was no teacher, just a tired man with a hammer and a patch of dirt. But then he looked at Caleb wide-eyed, hopeful, and nodded. "All right," he said, "but you'll need to bring cookies." The next week, a yellow school bus rattled its way down the dirt road, and 20-something kids piled out like spilled marbles, filling the clearing with laughter and awe. Samuel stood stiffly on the platform, nerves chewing at his gut. But he spoke, softly at first about his grandfather, about how rail cars like this were once the height of travel, then louder about how they were built with care by hands that rarely got credit, and finally, honestly about how this car had been abandoned, like him. "But now," he said, resting a hand on the weathered door, "it's full of stories, just like all of us." The children were quiet, not because they didn't understand, but because they did. That night, as Samuel sat beside the fire with Caleb and Grace sharing stew and sweet cornbread, the forest didn't feel like wilderness anymore. It felt like a town with no walls. Autumn arrived like an old friend, slow, steady, and rich with color. The leaves turned to fire overhead, and every morning, Samuel Carter woke to the scent of earth and wood smoke. The Pullman car stood proud now, not polished, not perfect, but proud. Its deep green paint caught the afternoon sun like a memory retold, and the brass fixtures gleamed where he'd scrubbed away the corrosion of decades. But what changed more than the rail car was Samuel himself. He moved differently now, not faster his knees wouldn't allow it, but steadier, with purpose. Each task, each nail, each repaired hinge or scrubbed surface was more than a chore. It was therapy, forgiveness, restoration, for the rail car, for his community, and maybe, most of all, for himself. Inside, the walls were no longer bare. There were books, tools, drawings from Caleb, pressed flowers from Grace's garden, and a photo of Amelia, framed in cedar and placed above the sleeping cot like a silent guardian. Samuel had mounted his grandfather's tools on the wall beside his own side by side. Generations of hands that had built, repaired, and tried their best with what they had. Outside, he'd cleared a path from the road to the tracks, laid flat stones, and lined the edges with river rock from the nearby creek. The steps leading to the door were smooth, worn from visitors' boots. He'd even added a small wind chime made from spare copper pipe. When the breeze passed through, it sounded like memory humming. And people kept coming. The woman from the garden co-op brought pots of thyme, basil, and mint. 2 teenage girls arrived one Saturday with a patchwork quilt they'd sewn in home ec. "We wanted it to feel warm," one of them said, draping it gently over the cot. Every small act stitched the community into the fabric of the place. But Samuel hadn't spoken about his own family, not really. Not about his son, Marcus, not since the fight, not since the words too sharp to take back were spoken through clenched teeth and wet eyes. "You gave everything to Mom, nothing to me." She was dying, Marcus, and I was alive, alone, raising myself in that damn house. The silence that followed had lasted 7 years. Samuel had written letters, crumpled them, started again, let the wound fester, and yet every nail he hammered, every child he taught how to grip a tool. Part of him was speaking to Marcus. Then, one evening, while reorganizing Amelia's old Bible, a folded piece of paper slipped out. A letter in her handwriting. "To Marcus, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. but know your father loved you in his own quiet way. He didn't always say it, didn't always know how, but he gave all he had. Be kind to him, if you can. He never stopped trying. Samuel sat for a long time. The forest was silent, save for the wind through the branches and the creak of the Pullman's frame settling in the cold. The next morning, he wrote a letter, a story, not a plea, not an apology shaped by guilt, but something honest about what he'd done, what he was still doing, about the people who had shown up, about Amelia, about the Pullman, about the lessons he was still learning in the quiet of the woods. He folded it, placed it in an envelope, and left it on the workbench. It sat there for 3 days. Then, without fanfare, he walked to the post office in town, told the clerk, "First class, please." When he stepped back into the sun, his chest didn't feel lighter, not yet, but it felt open. That same week, Caleb brought 2 of his friends to help Samuel build the raincatch system he'd been sketching for weeks. Miss Evelyn came by with apple pie and a request. Would you consider hosting a storytelling night for the neighborhood? He didn't say yes, not at first. But that night, under the soft flicker of the lanterns, with the journal of his grandfather in his lap and the smell of pine smoke curling through the air, he whispered into the silence, "Maybe I will." Samuel Carter had been many things: a soldier, a husband, a father, a man broken by time, but here, in a clearing in the woods, surrounded by rust, firelight, and community, he was becoming whole again. It was the 13th day since Samuel had mailed the letter. He didn't count out loud, he didn't mark it on a calendar, but he knew his bones told time in ways clocks never could. He was by the herb pots that morning, kneeling in the dirt, when he heard it, footsteps on the gravel path. Not Caleb's light skips, not Grace's steady stride. He stood slowly, brushing soil from his jeans. A man appeared at the tree line. Tall, broad-shouldered, close-cropped hair flecked with gray, a dark jacket, dusty boots. His face older than Samuel remembered, but unmistakably his son. Marcus. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them held every unsent letter, every silent holiday, every word left unsaid. Then, quietly, Marcus spoke, "Dad." Samuel's throat closed. He nodded, stepping forward. "I got your letter," Marcus said, voice rough. "I didn't know if I should come, but I—" He faltered. Samuel didn't wait for the end of the sentence. He reached out, Marcus did too, and there, under the rusted curve of the Pullman car's roofline and the whispering pines above, father and son embraced. No speeches, no apologies, just arms around shoulders and years crumbling like dry leaves. Later, they sat together on the wooden platform, a mug of cider in each hand. They didn't speak much, didn't have to. The fire crackled nearby. The forest breathed gently around them, and the silence, for once, wasn't a wound. "You really built all this?" Marcus asked after a while. Samuel looked out over the clearing. "With help," he said. "Neighbors, strangers, and your mom, in her own way." Marcus gave a soft smile, eyes glinting. She always knew how to show up, even when she wasn't there. The next day, they worked together like they hadn't in years. Marcus held beams steady while Samuel hammered. He tightened bolts on the tool rack. They reinforced a loose wall panel near the rear of the car, laughing when a startled squirrel leapt out of the insulation. In the afternoon, Caleb arrived with his usual grin, skidding to a halt when he saw Marcus. "You must be his kid," he said with a smirk. Marcus chuckled. "Last I checked." The two fell into easy conversation, Caleb eagerly pointing out every detail of the train car like a tour guide. "That hook, I put it in, and that corner, we fixed it after the storm, and over there's where the raccoon got in. He tried to make it his room." Miss Grace arrived not long after, casserole dish in hand, her expression softening when she saw father and son working side by side. "So, this is the Marcus I've heard so little about," she teased. Marcus scratched his neck sheepishly. "I tend to keep a low profile." "Well," she smiled, "you're welcome here now, long as you like." That evening, something remarkable happened. People came not just one or two, but dozens. Word had spread of Samuel's project, that a once-forgotten veteran had turned a scrap of steel into something beautiful. A retired welder brought a lamp to donate. A baker offered cinnamon bread. Children carried their parents down the path, chattering about the train in the woods. There were no formal invitations. Just a fire pit, folding chairs, warm cider, and stories. Samuel stood near the door, hands calloused, shirt dusted in sawdust, heart fuller than it had been in decades. When Miss Evelyn asked if he'd share a story, he didn't hesitate. He stepped forward and spoke not as a soldier, not as a broken man, but as a builder, a steward of something that was once forgotten and now found. He told of the first night he slept in the cold, of the crate he'd discovered, of the notebook with his grandfather's words, "Build with humility." He spoke of the boy who had appeared out of nowhere, asking for a hammer, the mother who brought cornbread and comfort, the letter from the past that opened a future, and the son once lost who had come home. When he finished, there was silence. Then applause. Not loud, not showy, just honest. That night, the Pullman car glowed from within, lit by lanterns and laughter. It was no longer just Samuel's home. It was everyone's. And as the music from a crackling radio played a soft blues tune from the 1950s, Samuel stood beside Marcus beneath the carved sign that read, "Hopeline et 1924. "You staying?" Samuel asked. Marcus looked around at the people, the trees, the train car that had somehow healed more than rust. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I'd like to come back. Help. Be here." Samuel nodded. That's enough. And in that moment, he realized he hadn't just rebuilt a rail car. He'd rebuilt a life. Samuel Carter didn't set out to inspire anyone. He wasn't trying to start a movement or build a sanctuary. All he wanted was a place to survive his grief somewhere quiet, where the world wouldn't expect anything of him. But what he found in the rusted bones of an old Pullman car was something no blueprint could ever predict: purpose. The lesson wasn't in the nails or wood or salvaged brass. It was in the silence that no longer hurt, in the boy who wanted to learn, in the neighbors who showed up, in the son who came home. Samuel learned that healing isn't loud, it's slow and steady, and built one nail at a time. That restoration doesn't erase the scars, it honors them. In a world quick to discard what's old, broken, or forgotten, Samuel became proof that value is not in perfection, but in persistence. His journey reminds us that even the most rusted parts of ourselves can become the foundation for something sacred. If this story moved you, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you won't miss what's next. Share it with someone who needs a little hope. Today, it truly helps us grow. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.